In March 1945, Germany sent its last great armored reserve into western Hungary. King Tigers led the attack, but one of the machines waiting for them had no turret, no machine gun, and no intention of fighting like a tank. It sat low behind the earth, almost invisible. Its crew watched a narrow lane through the mud, and when the first German vehicle entered that lane, they fired a 100mm shell moving at nearly 900 meters per second. The Germans came to Lake Balaton expecting a breakthrough. Instead, they drove into a battlefield built to make their greatest strength, the weight of their armor, work against them. And hidden inside that trap was the SU-100. By 1944, the Red Army had a problem it could no longer solve with courage alone. German armor had evolved faster than many Soviet anti-tank weapons. The Tiger I could kill from long range and absorb punishment from the front. The Panther combined thick, sloped armor with a gun that could destroy a T-34 before the Soviet crew had a comfortable shot. And the King Tiger pushed the same idea to an extreme. More armor, more gun, more weight. Earlier Soviet assault guns had been valuable against bunkers, infantry positions, and medium tanks. But when a heavy German vehicle appeared across open ground, Soviet crews were often forced to close the distance, aim for a side plate, or wait for the enemy to expose a weakness. Every one of those solutions placed the Soviet crew in greater danger. The Red Army did not need another giant tank that would take too long to build. It needed a hunter, low enough to hide, simple enough to mass produce, fast enough to shift between firing positions, and armed with a weapon that could reach into the ranges German crews once considered safe. The answer began with the D-10S. Its lineage came from naval artillery, a long, high-velocity 100mm gun adapted for a self-propelled vehicle. The barrel was long, the cartridge was powerful, and an armor-piercing projectile left the muzzle at roughly 900 meters per second. That velocity mattered. It flattened the trajectory, reduced the gunner's margin for error, and delivered enough energy to threaten the frontal or turret armor of many German tanks at serious combat distances. The D-10S did not make every German heavy tank helpless from every angle. Nothing did. But it changed the terms of the fight. A Soviet crew no longer had to treat every Tiger as a steel fortress that could only be approached from the side. At the right range, from the right position, the SU-100 could strike first and make the first hit decisive. The vehicle built around that gun was deliberately unspectacular. Its running gear came from the proven T-34 family. Instead of a rotating turret, the gun was fixed inside a low-armored casemate. The frontal plate was thick and sharply sloped. A 500-horsepower diesel engine gave the vehicle the mobility to cross broken ground and relocate quickly. Inside, the crew had only 33 rounds, 33 chances, and because the gun had only limited movement left and right, the driver often had to turn the entire hull to bring the weapon onto a new target. In a close-range fight, that was dangerous. A turreted tank could swing its gun while moving. The SU-100 had to pivot, settle, aim, and fire. But the missing turret brought three advantages that mattered more to the Soviet design. It kept the vehicle low, it kept the weight manageable, and it allowed factories to place a very large gun on a chassis already understood by Soviet mechanics, drivers, and production crews. The SU-100 was not built to lead a charge, it was built to disappear. A crew could dig the hull into a reverse slope, cover it with branches and earth, and leave only the gun and the upper front visible. From a distance, the vehicle became part of the landscape. Then the barrel moved. The first production vehicles left Euromash in late 1944. They reached combat units while the Red Army was already moving through Eastern Europe. The crews immediately understood the bargain. They had a weapon powerful enough to kill the tanks they feared. But only if they refused the kind of battle those tanks wanted. The SU-100 survived through discipline, concealment, range, crossfire, and a prepared route backward. That doctrine was about to be tested against the strongest armored force Germany still possessed. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing in almost every direction. The Western Allies had crossed into Germany. The Red Army was moving toward Berlin. German industry was being torn apart from the air. But one shortage haunted every German headquarters more than the others. Fuel. Without fuel, a Tiger was not a fortress. It was a 70-ton obstacle. Western Hungary still held oil fields and refineries that mattered to the Reich. Hitler therefore ordered a final offensive around Lake Balaton, not toward Berlin but toward the region that could still feed his tanks. The operation was called Spring Awakening. Its striking force included the 6th SS Panzer Army, transferred east after the failed Ardennes offensive. Alongside other German and Hungarian formations, it brought veteran armored divisions, assault guns, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers into a narrow area of western Hungary. The plan was ambitious: break the Soviet front, drive toward the Danube, protect the oil region, disrupt the Soviet route toward Vienna. On a map, the armored spearheads looked powerful enough to split the front, but maps do not show what thawing soil does beneath 70 tons of steel. The offensive began before dawn on March 6, 1945. A short artillery preparation struck the Soviet positions. Then the German columns moved. Almost immediately the ground began choosing sides. Winter was ending. The frozen surface had softened into a deep, adhesive mud that swallowed road shoulders, fields, and approach lanes. Lighter vehicles struggled, heavy vehicles sank. The King Tiger had been designed to dominate a battlefield through armor and firepower. Here its weight became a mechanical sentence. Tracks spun, engines screamed. Recovery vehicles bogged down, trying to reach tanks that had already bogged down. Columns were forced onto roads and firmer strips of ground, the exact places Soviet observers had already measured. The Germans had brought armor designed to control open space. The mud compressed that armor into funnels, and the Soviet defenses were waiting at the end of them. Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin's Third Ukrainian Front had not been blind to the buildup. Reconnaissance, intelligence, and the pattern of German movement all pointed toward a major armored assault. Soviet commanders had learned at Kursk that the best way to break a German offensive was not to meet it in a single dramatic collision. It was to make the Germans pass through layer after layer of resistance, mines to slow them, artillery to channel them, infantry to hold the ground, anti-tank guns to force deployment, mobile reserves to seal the breach, and self-propelled guns positioned far enough back to kill the tanks that survived everything in front. Around Lake Balaton, the Red Army built dozens of anti-tank strongpoints across a defensive system many miles deep. This was not a wall. A wall can be breached. It was a series of jaws. The first jaw slowed the German armor. The second separated tanks from infantry. The third waited for the survivors. Into that final layer came nearly 200 SU-100s, concentrated in powerful self-propelled artillery formations, including the 207th, 208th, and 209th Brigades. They were not scattered as emergency weapons. They were placed where the German advance was most likely to be forced. The crews prepared firing pits. They measured ranges to roads, embankments, village edges, and gaps between tree lines. They marked routes for withdrawal. They waited with engines silent. Then a German column appeared. The range might be 1,000 meters or more. The commander identified the target. The gunner laid the sight. The loader drove a heavy round into the breach. The SU-100 eased forward just enough to clear the earth in front of its barrel. One shot. Then another. A Panther stopped in the lane. A second vehicle turned and exposed its side. A third tried to reverse, blocking the machines behind it. Before German return fire could settle on the muzzle flash, the Soviet driver pulled backward into cover. The firing position went quiet. Minutes later, another gun opened from a different angle. That was the SU-100 at its best. Not charging, not trading shots in the open. Appearing for seconds, hitting hard, and vanishing before the enemy could answer. The D-10S was built for that moment. Its high velocity shortened the time between muzzle flash and impact. Its flat trajectory made range estimation less forgiving for the target and more manageable for the gunner. The German crews could still kill in 100. But first they had to find it. And the battlefield was crowded with false shapes, torn hedges, dark earth, wrecked wagons, roof lines, smoke and rain. The Soviet vehicle's low silhouette was not a design detail anymore. It was survival. The fighting remained brutal. The German formations were experienced, heavily armed, and still capable of local breakthroughs. When Soviet infantry was displaced, when artillery support failed, or when a firing position was exposed, the turretless Su-100 could become dangerously vulnerable. On March 12, a hard German attack tore into one Soviet sector and knocked out 17 Su-100s. 17 crews and vehicles lost in a single violent action. That number matters because it destroys the easy version of the story. The SU-100 was not invincible. Its armor could be penetrated. Its limited gun traverse could become a trap. Its crew compartment was cramped, and 33 rounds disappeared quickly in sustained fighting. A German tank that reached the flank had every advantage. The Soviet crews won only when the whole defensive system remained intact, and for 10 days that system bent without breaking. German spearheads gained ground in places, but the advance never became the operational rupture Hitler needed. Every mile cost time, fuel, vehicles, and trained crews Germany could no longer replace. The deeper the Germans pushed, the farther they moved from firm roads and prepared support. The mud held them. The mines narrowed them. The artillery broke their formations, and the Su-100s waited wherever the surviving tanks were forced to appear. By the middle of March, spring awakening had spent its momentum. The offensive had achieved only a shallow penetration, measured in miles, not in the strategic objectives on Hitler's map. The Danube had not been reached. The Soviet route toward Vienna had not been closed. The oil region had not been made secure. Germany's last major armored offensive had consumed fuel to defend fuel and failed. Then the direction of movement reversed. On March 16, the Red Army opened its counteroffensive. German units that had spent 10 days pushing into the Soviet defenses now had to withdraw through the same mud, the same narrow roads, and the same damaged crossings. Vehicles that could not be recovered were abandoned. Others ran short of fuel. Some were destroyed by their own crews. The armored force that had entered Hungary as Hitler's final reserve came out shattered, depleted, and incapable of mounting another operation on the same scale. The failure at Balaton did not merely stop an attack. It removed the last serious armored obstacle from the Soviet drive toward Vienna. Within weeks, the fighting had moved west. The battlefield around the lake was left with the evidence: broken tracks, burned hulls, abandoned heavy tanks, and firing pits where low Soviet vehicles had waited beneath camouflage. The SU-100 did not win Lake Balaton by itself. The mud mattered, the mines mattered, the infantry and artillery mattered. Soviet intelligence, engineering, reserves, and defensive depth mattered. But the SU-100 gave that system a long-range killing edge. It was the weapon placed behind the obstacles, the answer waiting after German armor had been slowed, separated, and forced into a predictable lane. That was why its lack of a turret was not a failure of imagination. It was a declaration of purpose. The SU-100 was not designed to control every direction. It was designed to dominate one direction at the exact moment the enemy had no choice but to enter it. At Lake Balaton, Germany brought the heaviest tanks it could still fuel. The Red Army answered with a machine that did not need to chase them. It only needed to wait for the ground, the defenses, and the German plan to deliver them into its sight. The last great panzer offensive did not die in a single duel. It died inside a trap, and the SU-100 was one of the teeth that closed it.